Welcome, everyone. My name is Scott Barrett. I'm a professor in the School of International and Public Affairs and the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And I'm welcoming you to our seminar, COVID-19 Policymaking in the Throes of a Global Crisis. My co-host is Jeffrey Sachs. He's having some technical problems, but he'll be joining us very shortly. And I'm also joined by Yanis Ben Amour, who is an adjunct professor in SIPA and also works with Jeff Sachs in the Center for Sustainable Development. Our speaker today is Professor Joseph Stiglitz, and his topic will be macroeconomic impacts and policy responses. So I want to start now with a brief introduction to Joe Stiglitz. I actually could spend the entire hour. Hey, Jeff, you've joined us now. Great. But you're muted. You have to take off the mute.
Sorry, I was battling the link again. Hey, Joe, how are you?
Hi, fine.
Well, it's great to have you here. I'm just introducing Joe, but before I introduce him, I wanted to explain to the audience how difficult it is to introduce Joe Stiglitz, because his activity level, I mean, Joe and Jeff together make me feel very small and insignificant, I have to say. The activity level is quite astonishing. So I'm going to give just a brief summary and some highlights. Joe Stiglitz is a university professor at Columbia University. He's also a professor in SIPA. He, of course, has Nobel Prize in economics awarded in 2001. He's the author of many books, including most recently, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, and another book, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. He has a long career in public service as well, including as chief economist at the World Bank, and former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Massive influence on economics, and all in policy and in political debate, and particularly emphasizing in the last decade plus the importance of inequality and how that gets addressed through our economic policies. So Joe, we're going to turn over to you. We're delighted you're here, and you'll speak for around about 20 minutes, and then Jeff and I will ask some questions. Yanis will join us, and then we'll take some questions from the floor. So over to you, Joe Stiglitz. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, and thank you for organizing this kind of seminar. I think it's really important to focus what intellectual capacities we have on solving this problem. And it's both the pandemic, the spread of the disease, but now we're dealing with the economic aftermath, which has been absolutely devastating. The most significant economic downturn, people say since the Great Depression, but in terms of the speed of the downturn, it's worse than the Great Depression. There's a slight bounce back, but nobody should confuse that slight bounce back with a V-shaped recovery. The likelihood is that we will not get back to where we were, say, in the end of 2019, at least until 2022, maybe longer than that. And the answer to whether we get back, how soon we get back, and how deep the downturn, macroeconomic downturn is, will depend on the policies we put into place. So I want to discuss those policies with a few references to where there's controversy. There shouldn't be a lot of controversy, but there are a couple of issues that have entered in America where everything is polarized. So I want to say a few words about that. I'm going to focus mostly on the United States, but all of us have been involved in this as a global event, and I believe there won't be a strong US recovery unless there's a strong global recovery. So I hope we'll have time, probably in the question and answer period, to talk about the multilateral response, issues of debt restructuring, debt forgiveness, debt stays, and issues of the SDR issuings, how the global community can respond. But I'm focusing here mostly on the US and some comparisons between the US and other countries. There's another talk I could have given, and I can't help but say a little bit about that. This is a natural experiment, not one that we would have welcomed, but the disease has affected countries all over the world, and some have responded well, and some have responded very poorly, both in terms of the control of the disease and the economic aftermath. And so, as an economic experiment and a social and political experiment, as a social scientist, one of the things that we have to do is to ask, can we account for the successes and the failures, both in terms of what kinds of societies, polities, economies have done well and poorly. And what is very clear is that if you were to describe what kinds of things make for a good economy, I wrote a book on the subject right before the crisis, my book, People, Power, and Profits, where I said, why is it that we have higher standards of living than we did 250 years ago? Why is it that some societies have more inequality? What is the source of the wealth of nations? And basically, the argument was reliance on science. Science is what has increased our standard of living. The development of systems of social organization for complex societies. We've moved beyond primitive agriculture to that requires mechanisms of assessing the truth, rule of law, checks and balances, a whole number of institutions involved in social organization and assessing the truth, disseminating the truth, and so forth. And overall, a balance between the private and the public sector and civil society. And that much of what has happened in the United States over the last 40 years has destroyed that balance. And what I called for in that book was a restoration of that balance. Well, if you look across countries that have done well, it's countries that have promoted trust, solidarity, strengthening institutions, democratic institutions. Countries like New Zealand, South Korea, Germany, and countries that have done badly are countries where there are demagogues, would-be authoritarian figures who have, as part of their political agenda, been trying to divide their societies. You see it in India, you see it in Brazil, you see it, we feel it very strongly in the United States. So that's the broad perspective of something that we've learned about our society, and really some first order effects that we often don't, as we talk about economics, talk about, but this has seen these societal characteristics writ large as a primary determinant of success and failure. Now, in terms of the macroeconomics, we've learned a lot from prior economic downturns. There are some similarities between this downturn and some differences. The key similarity is whatever the source of the downturn, whatever the shock, whether it's a banking shock as it was in 2008, economic downturns have a kind of pattern, a similar pattern. Balance sheets of corporations and households get weakened. That reduces investment and consumption. It leads to bankruptcies and the loss of organizational and informational capital. And there's a vicious cycle. So economists say there are hysteresis effects, that it's important to act early to prevent these effects. You know, to use an old phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This is one of those things. An ounce of trying to stop spending money now to stop the worst devastations is worth, saves a lot of money down the line. And that's going to be an important part of the framework of responding. So that's what we know from other crises. But this crisis is very different in that it has affected some sectors much more than others. It has affected some groups much more than others. And unfortunately, the groups that it has affected are those who are already at the bottom of the income distribution. It has exposed the inequalities in health in the United States, larger health disparities. This is not an equal opportunity virus, and it goes after people with poor health. And we have a lot of people in that state. And it also exposes the importance of social protection systems. We have the weakest social protection of the advanced countries. We don't have paid sick leave. And when you have the combination of high levels of poverty or low income, people living paycheck to paycheck, and no paid sick leave, people who can go to work who are sick, go to work, spreading the disease. So we have, you might say, the perfect conditions for the spread of the disease. And that would be true even if we didn't have all this misinformation, all the weakening of our Centers for Disease Control as a result of the defunding of those important institutions and the attack on sciences that Trump has had. So those are some of the preconditions in the United States that have made us more vulnerable to the disease. Now, as I think in response to these facts of what we know from previous crises and this particular pandemic, there are a set of priorities that should shape our response. The first is, obviously, we won't recover the economy until the pandemic is put under control. So health is number one. And this is an area of continuing contestation where the right says that we have unnecessarily shut down the economy. Their argument is put us older people off into isolation and let the healthy young people who are on the left, on one side of the screen, go out and play, and nobody will die. And we have strong economic activity. The evidence is totally against that. That is to say, countries that have tried that have only had a modicum of success. And the countries that took a hard lockdown, like New Zealand, managed to control the disease and then get the economy to go. And South Korea is similar. South Korea is one of the two economies that's expected to have positive growth in 2020. Of course, the other economy that is expected even stronger growth is China. But I think some of the more authoritarian surveillance technologies that they use would probably be unacceptable in the United States. But that's why I mentioned South Korea, Germany, and New Zealand, because these are countries that have responded and controlled the disease within a democratic framework. So that, I think, is the number one. And it's interesting, it's still under debate. One of the things that the Democrats have said in the next round of assistance, there has to be adequate support for health. And the Republicans are not interested in that. So that to me is number one priority. The second one is vulnerable. As I said, this is not an equal opportunity virus. It's going after frontline workers who are both in poor health, but also more exposed and are providing us essential services. So that's where extended UI is very important, extended unemployment insurance. It's been a lifeline, but the United States, unlike most other countries, only provides 26 weeks of unemployment benefits. Those are now running out. And some states in the United States provide absolutely the most miserable unemployment insurance. Your unemployment benefits are a fraction of your normal income. So the evidence is overwhelming that those checks made a big difference, particularly for the people at the bottom. One of the contentions on the right was that they resulted in people not looking for jobs. You know, the reason people are unemployed is there are no jobs. But one of the things that is good about the United States is we have a rich data set because different states do different things. And so we can use that cross-section variation to test that hypothesis. And the overwhelming evidence is that unemployment insurance is not causing the unemployment problem. So that contention of the right has been totally debunked. A third objective in early on was that we want to retain workers' connection with their employer for three reasons. First of all, we knew that the unemployment insurance systems did not have the capacity to respond to a surge of unemployment of the kind that we had, millions and millions. They just didn't have the capacity. So we didn't want to put that burden on them. Secondly, Americans depend on employer-provided health insurance. And if they separate, then there's a health insurance problem. And this is not the time to have people without health insurance. Thirdly, we hope we'll have a robust recovery, and you can restart the economy if the links between the worker and the firms are kept. Other countries, like Denmark, design programs that enable them to do that. France, New Zealand, it's not just one, many countries. We failed miserably. And I can go on in the question period about why we failed miserably. I had urged members of the Congress to adopt the Danish model. They didn't. There was legislation introduced supporting that. It didn't get through. The fourth element, obviously, is helping small businesses, many of whom are fragile, to get through the period. Now, this is where things are beginning to change. When it was thought it was going to be a V-shaped recovery, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 10 weeks, then liquidity was important, making sure they had enough money to survive. Now that we're going into 6 months, the issue becomes solvency. And that is to say, if you go 6 months without any revenues, you're going to go bankrupt. How to handle that is an order of magnitude more difficult. And there are a whole set of liquidity issues that are now being raised. When we had a stay on evictions and mortgage payments, what that meant was that lower income people were getting more and more into debt. What they owed was accumulating. So now, when the pandemic is over, they will owe 6 months, a year of rent. They're not going to be able to pay it. So we are having a housing crisis looming on our doorstep, and it's something that we're going to have to deal with. More broadly, one of the issues that we're facing now, 6 months into the crisis, is we spent an awful lot of money. People are worried about the amount of debt we've accumulated. Our deficit GDP ratio last year, I think, is clocked in at 18-19% of GDP, a record. Kind of number that you see in banana republics, but you don't expect to see in the United States. That has two implications. The first is it does mean resources are scarce. That's the basic hypothesis of economics, and you have to spend the money well. One part of spending the money well is not wasting money. Not wasting money means some of the money that we spent, for instance, for airline bailouts, went to companies that weren't deserving. And by that, I mean, they would not have been in that position if they had not taken their billions of dollars of benefits that they got out of the tax cut for the corporations in 2017 and had stock buybacks, paid their CEO so much, and paid so much on dividends. The reality is, for those large corporations, what will happen if you don't give them aid is they go bankrupt. But what does bankrupt mean? Under Chapter 11, the company doesn't disappear. The assets don't disappear. There's a corporate reorganization. The shareholders lose money. They should lose money. They got a big bonanza in 2018 and 19. Some of the bondholders may lose some money, but the organization continues. That's why we have Chapter 11. So that was a mistake not to use Chapter 11 for that. If we had a lot of money to throw away, that would be one thing, but we don't. The second important implication is we have to build back better. We have to make sure that this money goes to dual, triple, quadruple purpose. By that I mean, we don't want to go back to where we were in January 2020. We had a society, economy that was not resilient, was not equal, not green, not enough knowledge-based. Never has government spent so much money. But in the United States, we had no vision. And now we want to make sure that the next round of spending is based on a vision, and that every dollar we spent, to the extent possible, reflects this broader vision. Other countries have done much better in that respect. Europe's green recovery, both in terms of the allocation of money and the conditions you impose on those who take their money. It was an enormous opportunity to help reshape the economy. We didn't take advantage of that. Hopefully, in a new administration, we'll be able to do that. And this will be a moment where we finally have the will to spend a lot of money, and we'll do it to reshape our economy. The final macroeconomic question is, in a few quarters, there's a worry about enough is enough. You see that in the Republicans. The Republicans in the Senate, not Trump. He's a populist who doesn't know about budget constraints. He never did. As a business person, you get into debt and then you go bankrupt and you screw everybody else. That's his business model. So for him, debt is, he loves debt. But for ordinary Republicans, the only debt they like is to finance a tax cut for the billionaires and corporations. So they're saying, now that poor people are suffering, we've reached the limit of our debt. And they put together a small bill, quarter of what is necessary, or less than a quarter. The answer, I already said in the beginning, not spending money is going to cost us a lot more in the long term. We build half a bridge, you might say, to the other side, the post-pandemic world, and half a bridge doesn't get you anywhere. It gets you, you go over that halfway and then you fall into the precipice. So we have to finish building that bridge. And it is really penny wise and pound foolish not to do that. The other question that some people worry about, and I was just in a Zoom with the heads of a couple of central bankers. They're beginning to worry about not only debt, but some of them are worrying about inflation. There's no inflation on the horizon. The head of the Federal Reserve has basically said that. No inflation is showing up. The bond market doesn't see any inflation. Obviously, sometime in the future, given the magnitude of the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet and the amount of money that's being spent, it is not inconceivable that there could be inflationary pressures. I don't see it happening anytime soon. But if it does, we have the tools to respond, both monetary and fiscal policy. Monetary policy is much more effective in constraining spending than pushing spending. So it can be very effective in constraining spending. And we have, you might say, vastly underutilized capacity for taxing. And by that I mean, we have a regressive tax system. If we just made it progressive, make those at the top pay the same share, their fair share of taxes, you would generate trillions of dollars, making the corporations pay their fair share. You would generate trillions of dollars. Imposing some environmental tax would generate trillions of dollars. So we really have enormous capacity to raise more taxes when the appropriate time comes. So I think the agenda, the macroeconomic agenda is very clear. Targeted spending can not only help the economy recover from the pandemic, but actually reshape our economy in ways that deal with some of the long-standing problems, making our economy more knowledge-based, more greener, and more equal. Let me stop there.
Joe, thank you so much. That's a brilliant overview. It's such a profound topic because this crisis has hit when there have already been all these kind of latent and not so latent vulnerabilities and fragilities in particularly the US system, but also in the global system, partly because the US is not fully participating in global affairs right now. We have a lot of really great questions here. Let me start with one, and then I'll turn to Jeff, and then Yanis, and Andrew has a question as well. And then I want to translate some of these questions that I'm reading in the Q&A box. There's this famous expression about a crisis being an opportunity, and there's a little bit of that behind what you're saying. And certainly, we look back on the New Deal, and people discussing now a Green New Deal. It's obviously inspired by that history, and that New Deal restructured the United States in ways that have been enduring. So that even today, there are, strong legacy effects from that moment in time. What are the conditions that allowed those profound changes to be adopted at that time of crisis? Do they exist today, or is all the polarization and all the other things that you've been pointing to, are those barriers to us seizing an opportunity from, this crisis that we're in?
So let me give my optimistic perspective, because I don't think the country is as polarized as Trump makes it seem. If you look at the specific issues, not the identity politics, which is very polarizing, but you look at policies, 80% of Americans think there should be a substantial increase to the minimum wage. A vast majority of Americans are concerned about climate change. A majority of Americans, vast majority, believe everybody should have access to health care. If you put the question appropriately, better systems of social protection, access to education for all. I am actually struck about the degree of consensus there is on economic and social policies. And especially if you look at the young people, who's the laws. I always think that the young people ought to get more votes than us older people, because they have a longer life to live under the regime that's going to be created. It's not a very popular view, I suppose, among older people. But anyway, I do think that they have more at stake, and their voice ought to, therefore, they ought to have a greater voice. If you look at that, the support of the ideas that I just described are even more overwhelming. So if we had a leader that could try to unite the country around these commonly held views, I think we are at a moment of progress.
Well, it's wonderful to have some optimism. Jeff Sachs.
Joe, thanks a lot. Of course. But I wanted to ask you, Joe, about also with your vast experience in the U.S. government, how to embed some, as you said, some vision into the public spending. Last time we were in a situation something like this, 12 years ago, when President Obama came in the midst of the 2008 crisis. A stimulus bill was put together in a few weeks of about $880 billion that lasted 2 or 3 years, whatever the macro effects. It was not a long-term vision thing. And I think by the time we got around to the long-term vision stuff, the political momentum was gone. And in any event, the politics had shifted in Congress. Neither party is very good at the long-term thing, but assuming Biden wins, what institutions actually should we have either in the White House or somewhere to try to lengthen the time horizon of policy design? Because it seems to me we just don't even have a planning mechanism now for the longer term strategies.
No, you're absolutely right. I think we need to create. I think this pandemic has exposed a couple of deficiencies in our institutional framework. One of them is the voice of science is not being heard loud enough, and there is the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, but it's never had the voice that it should. I've been in a meeting with the physicists, and they're trying to, and they're not even in the center of this debate, but they feel very strongly that there is a need for somehow getting a broader voice of science in American policy. So I think that's one. The second one is the one, it's not about creating planning, it's thinking about long run. It's not like the old GOS plan in Russia. It's really vision, discussions about where our society wants to go. In that sense, climate is helpful because we know that's a long run problem. And we know but it's a long run problem that's already here. So it is both something that we have to deal with the here and now, but it is only going to be addressed through the long run. So this is really a moment to try. I think that's a wonderful idea, to try to create an institutional framework for long run discussions. You might say, the future of America kind of thing. There are particular, you might say, guidelines that can help shape thinking long term. And let me give you one that I was involved in when I was in the White House, and I'm involved in right now. Some of you may know that I've been involved in a suit against Trump on behalf of 21 children. Right. That other Columbia people have been very highly involved. And the argument is that the climate policy systematically does not give due process to children. We're leaving them, we're discriminating against them, you might say. And it violates what is called the public interest doctrine, national interest doctrine, that says that we hold our natural resources in trust for future generations. And these are two very legal doctrines. And the particular part of the argument I've been involved in is saying that institutionally, the way we evaluate the costs and benefits of regulations, of investments, doesn't give due attention to the future. So Trump administration uses a 7% discount rate. That is to say,
whoa, really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And that
Trump himself uses a 50% discount rate.
Exactly. But what that means is that a dollar benefit 50 years from now is worth 3 cents. So of course, if it's worth 3 cents, you're not going to spend much for the future. And one of the things that I did when I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors was to write guidelines that said we need to value the future a lot more. And we need to use a much lower discount rate. Wow. I wrote a paper with Ken Arrow for the IPCC in 1995, where we said that there's an argument even for using a negative discount rate once you take into account uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So the point is there are systematic procedures to embed in government that helps governmental decision makers think about the future.
Yeah. That's good. That's a really, really important idea. 7%, my God.
That had been the old, and we got rid of that, yeah. And then Trump reintroduced
Put it back.
Yeah. In a world where the interest rate is 0.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
That's crazy. That's crazy. Wow, that was a great discussion. Yanis, do you have a question for Joe?
Short, maybe it's an extreme question. I apologize in advance. So we've seen historically, whenever there were these major catastrophic events in the world, 1918, 1929, 1945, it sometimes brought like a new world order about. So we're coming out of 4 years of Trump. He has taken us out of every possible agreement with allies, good, bad, whatever. And he's taken us out of the WHO, the Paris Climate Agreement. And now we have this catastrophic pandemic situation at home with this economic crisis. On the other hand, you have China that you just reported did not have a similar economic crisis. So are we at the dawn of a new world order? Is this the beginning of a change in, international hegemony?
Oh, I think, let me put it more broadly. I think there are forces going in multiple different directions And where the world goes is not fully clear. But I'll express what my hope is, particularly if Biden gets elected. But it is a complicated picture. So on the one, and I'm going to be not just a two-handed, but I'll be a multi-handed economist. On the one hand, the pandemic has exposed the lack of resilience of our global supply chains. The United States couldn't even make mass protective gear, let alone complicated products like ventilators. So we were a little bit naive about globalization. And borders do matter. On the other hand, the pandemic, like climate change, reminds us that borders don't matter. The virus goes across borders, the CO2 molecules go across borders, and we need global cooperation to solve global problems. Absolutely. So on the other hand, at the end of the Cold War, there was a kind of naivety, a Pollyannish naivety, that was reflected in Francis Fukuyama's statement about the end of history, that we were all converging to market economies and liberal democracies. I don't think very many people see that right now. If it's convergence, it's a very, very slow convergence, and it's not monotonic. So we are, the violations of democracy, human rights that we've seen in Hong Kong and the Uyghurs are deeply troubling. And the surveillance economy has given new tools to create a totalitarian. And we've seen that democracy is under attack all over the world. Today, fewer people live in thriving democracies than earlier decades. So what I see is my hopeful view is that most citizens in most countries do share our values about human rights and democracy. If we can show to the countries of the third world that you can actually grow and respect democracy and human rights, that will be an unbeatable package. But that, of course, means that we have to be more generous in many ways than we've been. And that's where the SDR issues, the issuance of SDRs, $500 billion the United States and India veto, but there are bills in Congress for $2 trillion of issuance. Reforms in the global financial markets to allow better management of debt. In the post-pandemic world, there's likely to be a debt crisis in many, many countries. And our private sector is not cooperating very well in managing this debt. So we have to have new mechanisms, institutions for handling cross-border debt, in particular sovereign debt. We have to have fairer trade regimes. And Trump says the trade regime is unfair to the United States. I wrote a whole book explaining why it wasn't fair to developing countries and emerging markets. I always ask my students, who do they think was right, my book or Trump? And fortunately, all my students seem to agree with me on that. On
the issues of human rights, though, I mean, we're about to go backwards. If we intronize the 9th Supreme Court member that is being, reviewed right now, there is a high risk that the United States will go backwards. What message will this be sending to the world? I mean, I don't want to beleaguer this point because I want the students to be asking questions. I think we are at such a critical point for the United States as a country and also as a role model for the world, for the values that we may ourselves be losing. And it's very worrisome.
No, I agree with you. It's very worrisome. I believe that this will mark a turning point. And this reflects Scott's question at the beginning. I think that there is such an overwhelming support for these values in the United States that we will triumph. You know, one of the reasons, let me make it very clear, why is it that the Republican Party has become a party that is so bent on undermining democracy? Why is it that they are engaged in voter suppression, what I call disenfranchisement? Why are they so engaged in disempowerment with gerrymandering, getting the Supreme Court so that they can prevent the will of the majority being respecting at the same time the rights of the minority? Why? Because their agenda is not an agenda that the vast majority of Americans want. So they're on the losing side of history. And that's the basis of my optimism. And I hope 2020 will be a defining point in that history.
Well, you just made the strongest statement in favor of democracy, of ultimate faith in people and the institutions to let the majority speak. So I think people have been losing some of that faith, and it's really heartwarming for me, at least, to hear you speak optimistically. Joe's answer to Yannis's question veered into the direction of Andrew's question about debt. Andrew, do you want to ask that? And then I want to raise two questions from the audience and then go back to Jeff. Jeff's the real macroeconomist here, so I want to make sure that Jeff asks another question too.
Sure, yeah. So Joe, just before we went live, you mentioned you've been working on a few international finance campaigns. I'm not a student of international finance, but it's something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in this seminar so far. And so I'm curious, I'd just like to ask a few more questions about that. I mean, it's, I think, fairly obvious, as you say, that nations, like firms and households here, are facing solvency constraints, pretty serious solvency constraints in the near future. I was following this recent BlackRock Argentina deal. I think you were working on that. My take is that it might presage a kind of like softer approach to international finance, maybe catalyzed by the pandemic. I'm curious what you think about that. I'm also wondering if you think the IMF should be doing more, or what institutions should be changed. I think this is going to be a pretty serious issue over the next year or so. So I'm just curious what you think.
No, I agree. It's going to be a very serious issue. You know, there was a big debt relief program in the Jubilee in 2000, and many of us worked on that. And unfortunately, no sooner was that over than the country started to get more in debt, with the private sector pushing countries to take on more private debt, which is even more difficult to manage, and China piling on debt as well. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the president of the UN asked me to chair the UN General Assembly asked me to chair a commission. I chaired a commission which looked at some of the reforms of the global financial architecture. One of our strong recommendations was the creation of an international framework for dealing with cross-border debt, including sovereign debt. That set of principles, that idea was endorsed by the General Assembly in 2014. In 2015, there were a set of principles adopted overwhelmingly by all but 6 countries. Unfortunately, among the 6 countries were the United States and the other big creditor countries. So nothing has happened. So we are not in a good position to deal with what is likely to be a large number of debt crises. Argentina, Ecuador, Lebanon are at the forefront, but there are many, many coming along. Now, the good news is at this particular moment, the IMF is headed by somebody who is from an emerging market, identifies with the emerging market, understands, And it's a big transformation. I mean, many of you may know that I've been very critical in the past of the IMF. They've been at the lead of trying to do something about the issue. And they played an extraordinarily constructive role in Argentina. They made it very clear that, to use my words, not theirs, you can't squeeze water out of a stone. And they try to identify what was the debt capacity, what were the limits, and the private bankers put their head in the sand and said, somehow mystically money is going to come out of nowhere. And so what if a few more million people die? That's part of life is hard, and that of course is unacceptable for any government. And the IMF really came in there in a very strong way, very helpful way. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. And the civil society campaigns, I think, are going to be getting ginned up to talk about debt relief, this yoke of debt around the necks of so many countries. And it's going to really impede a strong global recovery. We forget that the recovery of 2008-9 was actually led by the emerging markets. As Jeff said, we didn't provide enough money over a sustained enough period. And China played a very important role. China is not likely to do that this time around, at least to the same extent. Their growth forecast this time is 3%. In the aftermath of the 2009 crisis, they were growing at 10, 11, 12, 13%. So I think it is even more imperative that we have a broad-based recovery, and that means we have to do something about the debt, let alone the inhumanity of what happens when you don't have resources in the midst of a pandemic. This is about lives and deaths.
Yeah, there's a basic theme that's coming out of that. There's so much interconnection among all these different parts, and it's about the entire global arrangements, culture, science, ideology. It's quite extraordinary. I'm going to ask two questions on behalf of students. They've submitted a lot of really great questions, but I'm picking two. I'm just going to ask you both, and then Joe, you can answer these, and then I want to turn back to Jeff Sachs. So the first question is from, and I hope I pronounced the names correctly, or at least get close. Gaurav Pundir asks whether the US should adopt some form of universal basic income, as was introduced in one of the provinces in South Korea, apparently with some success. And the second question from Saiful Salihudin, who asks about this issue of trust and says, what can leaders do to build trust and solidarity in a diverse society, such as the United States now, amidst skepticism about globalization and diversity?
Both great questions. UBI, I have a strong view on. We are going to need to make an enormous amount of investment for the green transition. We have deficiencies on our infrastructure. We need to spend a lot more money caring for our educating our children, caring for our elderly. So I see the major problem in our society is people want to work. There are jobs that need to be done, but we haven't been able to figure out how to bring together the jobs that need to be done with the people who want to work, and making sure that in response to that work, they get paid decently, a livable wage. And so that's why I put my more focus on providing work for everybody who wants to do it, and making sure that the pay is decent. And that was the commitment we made in the Full Employment Act that was adopted after World War II. But we have never lived up to that. And there are large fractions of Americans, groups in America, have never had that kind of work opportunity. And that may require new institutions like the Civilian Conservation Corps after in the Great Depression. But the point is, it seems to me imperative that our commitment should be to making sure first that everybody who wants a job gets it. We'll need some kind of program to a safety net for the gaps in the system, which is what we've done. We basically had a form of UBI in the midst of the pandemic, but that's to take care of gaps in the system. The basic framework should be providing work for everybody who wants it. Restoring trust is, when it's been destroyed, is a really hard task. It is interesting and worth noting that other countries have a high level of trust in public institutions. Other countries have succeeded in getting a high trust in BBC, the Swedish media. 40 years of the Republican Party denigrating the government, denigrating society more broadly, have undermined trust. And so what we need is the kind of leadership that I think we'll get from Biden, which is unifying the country. That not a polity of division, which has been what's happened in the last 4 years, but a kind of policy that says, we're all in this together. We should share at least, we're not all going to agree on certain things. We know that there are some issues like abortion we're not going to agree on. But we should agree on the integrity of our institutions, on science, on, and yes, we are a diverse country. There'll be 5%, 10% that disagree with that. But one of the Enlightenment values is tolerance. Tolerance of people who disagree with you. And that should be a key part of the agenda of restoring trust. So rather than emphasizing our differences, emphasizing our commonalities, the extent to which we agree, and the value of tolerance of those who you disagree with. So it seems to me, it's going to be hard, given the work that's been done to undermine this. An important part of that agenda has to be reducing social and economic inequities, because there's not going to be an ability to get that kind of solidarity, the kind of trust, if people view the system as unfair, rigged, distorted. So those are at least some of the elements that I would emphasize.
This is definitely one of the more optimistic exchanges I've had in quite some time. So I'm feeling very good.
Well, we may feel very good next month or feel absolutely miserable. So.
Jeff, you want to ask Joe a question, a final question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. Thanks for a great session, Joe. I wanted to come back actually to the macro, as Scott suggested, just to close on a discussion. How do you see, and what would you recommend on the discussion about how we should think about public debt and deficits in the next few years? On the one hand, we're going to want to do a lot of spending, both for reconstruction, social needs, stimulus, and so on. On the other hand, the debt is large and we are undertaxed as a country. So in terms of guidelines, there are some in our party who say don't worry about the debts at all, full speed ahead. I wonder where you come out on the question of what kind of framework or rules or principles should be applied in choosing between. I think we all agree on the Democratic side of spending more money. How much through perhaps gradually rising revenue base versus outright debt financing and not worrying about the tax revenues at this point?
So let me begin maybe with mentioning an op-ed I published a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times on the issue at the state and local government level, because the states can't run deficits. So for them, the question is a very simple one. Should they raise taxes and spend more? Or should they leave taxes alone and go through austerity? My use of the word austerity has already given away my answer. What I argued very strongly was the benefit from the increased expenditure that increased tax revenues would provide is enormous. And here's the point, the macroeconomic benefits would be enormous as well. It's called the balanced budget multiplier, and we showed in that op-ed that balanced multiplier is likely to be very, very large. So the macroeconomic benefits would be very, very large. That has an important warning. Don't worry about raising taxes, depressing the economy, if you raise the right kinds of taxes. Mm-hmm. Raising taxes on corporations, very wealthy individuals, and spending that money is not going to depress the economy. So all this fear, don't raise taxes in the middle of a pandemic. If you're spending the money, that balanced budget framework says, go ahead. Yep. Now, overall, as I said before, I am not worried about the deficit, but the framework, you posed it correctly, what is the framework I think about it? Nobody would look at a corporation and look at the liability side alone. You always look at the balance sheet. So I always begin by saying, let's look at the asset and the liability side. And of course, in the public sector, it's more complicated, but look at it from a holistic point of view. If we don't invest in climate change, we're leaving our children a world that is bankrupt. So let's say we were asking me, would it make sense to get in debt in order to spend money that reduces the likelihood of climate change? I say absolutely, because they're going to be so much worse off if we don't make those investments. So let's be real. If you care about your children, make those investments. That's priority number one. So I very important to look at it from a holistic point of view. And I've been very critical of European constraints on 3% of GDP deficit. Italy has been saying we ought to have what they call a green rule. You can spend more than 3% if you're investing in climate change. Mm-hmm. So they've made it very clear that they want to not to think of that green investment as part of the liability that they're passing on. Okay, so and that's the framework of what we sometimes call it more broadly a capital budget.
Yep.
Now, the problem obviously is if you believe that you can spend without constraint, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Resources are limited when the economy is at full employment. Now, there's always a debate about what that means. And even when our official unemployment rate was very low, 3%, there was a lot of hidden unemployment. Some people estimate the true unemployment rate before the pandemic was probably 6%, maybe 7%. And that meant we could grow a few percentage points without reaching resource constraints. And it would make a big difference, particularly for excluded groups, if we got to that kind of tight economy. I believe strongly that we ought to have a very tight economy, you know, where there's some inflationary pressure. Mm-hmm. But at some point, there are limits. You know, you get to that tight economy, and then you have to say, if I spend, you know, resources are limited, and we have to make choices between spending more on X or more on Y. And that's where I put the first priority is raising taxes on the kind of taxes I talked about, not just redistributive taxes, but also efficiency-inducing taxes like environmental taxes and financial transaction tax.
Isn't it incredible, by the way, that in New York City, we can't find a way to get revenues with 111 billionaires in this city and the financial system? And they're cutting teachers and frontline workers instead.
Yeah. Taxation in state and local government is more complicated because people can move.
Mobility, yeah.
But the op-ed I mentioned cited some data that says that risk has been greatly exaggerated.
Right, exactly, by the billionaires. That's for sure.
Well, this has been an extraordinary session. It's got the perfect mix of intelligence, humanity, wisdom, and for me at least, a surprising dose of optimism. And I think that's a great combination for our students because, you know, it's really important that they believe that they can bring about the change. So I agree, Joe, with your proposal that they get more votes than we do. I hope they go out and vote and use those votes. They get more votes. And I think they also deserve, you know, more of a feeling that they can bring about the change and that can happen. Because certainly if people believe something can happen, it has a chance. And so I think that optimism is really important. So thank you, Joe Stiglitz. Thank you, Jeff Sachs, Yannis Benamor, Andrew Wilson. Thanks, everybody. It was a great session, and thanks to the students also for joining us. Take care, everybody.
And thank you, Scott.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Scott.
Bye.
Thanks for leading us.
Pleasure.